Thanks for joining us in the Trenches with Dave Lapham, brought to you by First Star Logistics, and it is NFL draft time. We know what an extravaganza it is. 3 days worth. Well, back when the Cincinnati Bengals were an expansion franchise, Bob Johnson was the first draft pick of the Cincinnati Bengals, All-American center at the University of Tennessee. So we caught up with Bob Johnson to get his perspective on what it was like to be the Bengals' first draft pick. And the stories that he has are worth listening to. You're going to like this with Bob Johnson. We appreciate you carving time to join us in the Trenches with Dave Lapham, brought to you by First Star Logistics, coming to you as always from our outstanding studios. And do we have a guest today? A very special guest, as the NFL draft is upon us. Here it is, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 3-day extravaganza. Well, this outstanding human being, Bob Johnson, the first draft pick ever by the Cincinnati Bengals franchise. And the draft was a little bit different back then. Bob, welcome, sir.
Well, you know, I owe you, David, because I think you saved me from not being able to block somebody. You picked him up, made me look reasonable. So, yeah, anything you want, buddy.
Bob, you were just an outstanding football player at University of Tennessee. You won all the awards that a lineman can win, plus the fact that you were 6th in the Heisman Trophy voting. That's unbelievable for a center to be 6th in the Heisman Trophy voting. Tell us about it.
Well, I think there's a couple factors there. You know, it's a little bit of a public relations campaign. You don't find many Heisman Trophy winners, at least way back when, from small schools. And so it's, you know, Tennessee had a good publicity department. B, we had a very good offensive line around me. I mean, it certainly wasn't just me. And they were, I think, together, if you looked at the strength of the team, we really ran the ball well. Of course, the rules were different then, as you well know, because you and I could not hold like we can now, like they can now, right. which I mean, you know, the powers to be want a wide open passing game. You know, they want the Burrows to chase, great catch, long throw. They don't want the 3 yards in a cloud of dust that you and I may have been better at than pass protection. But, you know, back then, we just had a really good team. And I think, you know, I think the Heisman voting was recognizing the good team, recognizing the offensive line, and picking one guy out of the line to push. But it was, I mean, that was great.
So Paul Brown, in his infinite wisdom, I remember him saying multiple times, yeah, when I put this football team together, there were 2 people on the offensive side of the football that touched the ball every single snap, the center and the quarterback. And I wanted to be taken care of in both of those spots. And one of the best players in the country was Bob Johnson at the center position. Were you told that when you were selected? What was it like? What was the process like when the Bengals reached out to you and drafted Bob Johnson back in, 1967 or early 68 or whatever it was?
It was 67. No, and like it was so different then than it is now. I mean, it was not on television. It was not really, the draft was not a big deal. I mean, it was going to be a big deal for me because, you know, back then there was absolutely no movement from one team to another, as you remember.
Right.
So whoever drafted you, if they wanted to keep you, you were there. So I'm sitting in Knoxville, Tennessee. I had just gotten married. Jane and I just got married. And, you know, we're wondering, where are we going to live for the next, we hope, 10 years. So, you know, are you going to live in Seattle? Are you going to be in, you know, Nashville wasn't there. So are you going to be in Atlanta? That'd be the closest team to us. And I didn't, yeah, I guess I knew the Bengals had been formed, but I didn't know much about the Bengals. And it was very different. So let me think about this. Oh, the Bears called me and said, we're going to draft you number 1, and they were the 6th pick. Huh. And I think I may have said this to you before, but they had the reputation, George Halas, the worst paying pro team. And like I said, there was no movement. You either, if you got drafted by those, you were going to get the George Halas deal. Well, so I was sitting there, and I sat there for, I guess, a couple hours, and nobody had called me. And I looked at Jane and said, "I'm going to class. This is stupid." I mean, I thought they sat around a table and said, "I got him, I got him," like a touch football game.
Right.
So I leave and go to class. So I come back about 2 hours later, and Jane's standing out in the parking lot in our married student housing that we were renting an apartment. And the first line out of her mouth was, "What's a Bengal?" Because it was the first year of the Bengals. She'd never heard of them. And she said, "This guy named Brown called, but I didn't get his first name, but he said he'd call back." So sure enough, Coach Brown, Paul Brown, called me about 30 minutes later, and I finally figured out that, yeah, they had drafted me second, which, it was a pretty amazing day.
Really? I mean, second pick of the draft, the first pick in franchise history. Now, there was an expansion draft and all that sort of thing, but in terms of mining college football talent, you were the first guy that the Cincinnati Bengals, ever drafted. Man, and like you said, back then there was no ESPN, there were no cell phones. I mean, there were no computers. I mean, it was like that.
Dark ages. We're old, Lap.
I'm telling
I'm
you,
older than you, but you're old too.
I am. I hit the big 7-0, man. I wasn't sure I'd make it, but here I am. But it's amazing how the draft has grown. I mean, it is an extravaganza now. Like we talked about, it's Thursday, first round, second and third round on Friday, fourth, fifth, and sixth round on Saturday. It's nationally televised. I mean, the revenue that is generated for the National Football League just for the draft alone is mind-boggling. You know, now in today's football, Bob, there are $50 million a year quarterbacks that are playing in the National Football League. Can you, in your wildest imagination, when you were drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals back then, could you foresee the National Football League would become the monster that it is?
No, and you got to give credit to pick a line of people, but people like Pete Rozelle and Paul Brown. I think they looked at the marketing that television can give, and football is a great game for television. You think about the strategy, and it's fun to sit there and watch offense and defensive strategies and the playback. I mean, it's a great television. It's a great television event. I mean, I think you can. Especially, I tape all the games so I can, if I go to the game, I can still come back and analyze why something worked and why it didn't work, and the defense outsmart the offensive coaches on this particular play. I mean, football is a fascinating game. I was amazed that anybody would draft a center that early, and I question how many people in retrospect would have done that again, because but I mean, back then football was different again. You couldn't use your hands, so you couldn't protect as well, so the passing game wasn't as prevalent. So if you looked at you probably know the stats, but the percentage of plays that are runs and passes now are very different, especially on first and second down, than they would have been back then. So it was a lot more of a running game.
No doubt about it. No question about that. So, I mean, what was it like when you get drafted? What did the Bengals do at that point in time? Did they say, "Bob, we're going to bring you to Cincinnati. We're putting together a football team. We want you to be"? I'm sure part of the reason that Bob Johnson, here's a team that's trying to sell itself to a city, and they want ambassadors. They want high character guys. They want to show that the Cincinnati Bengals franchise is stable and there are good people. Why not draft a guy like Bob Johnson? I mean, he's front and center. This guy, we can have him out there in the community right away. Was that part of your role as such?
I guess so. As my wife would say, you've always been a good talker, Bob. So, I mean, maybe public relations was part of it. And, there was a core of supporters. There was a quarterback club. I think it was probably still going when you were there, but it was really strong, especially. And a lot of the people, I think, that organized the effort to bring a franchise to Cincinnati were in it. And I remember, I shouldn't say this, being paraded out there as a spokesman to that quarterback club a couple of times. And, there was a couple of radio shows. And yeah, I think part of it was, I don't know how to say this nicely, but my ability to just blab on. Lap, you may have been right there with me, though.
I'm telling you, yeah. That's a common trait there with us. But yeah, I think representing the franchise in a very positive fashion, somebody that's articulate, has something to say and says it so well, I mean, you were like gold, I think, at that point. They're like, wow, this guy's a player.
I have to say, my wife is listening to this going, she's rolling her eyes right now. And of course, me in my heart of hearts think you're absolutely right.
No question about it. No question about it. So what was it like when you and Jane get to Cincinnati, you go through that part of the process, you find a place to live, training camp starts. Training camp back then, it was a 2-month process. I mean, you're involved up there at Wilmington, for a couple of months. What was the first training camp like for the Cincinnati Bengals, Bob?
Well, you can imagine you put together a team, and okay, so you had these the pros that were allocated, and you can imagine that these pros were available for various reasons, either at the end of their career or perceived to be at the end of their career, or they were still raw and young and not quite sure, the team didn't quite. But if you think about, if you're an established pro team back then, and you had to make available 6, 8, 10 guys that the Bengals or expansion team could draw from, you would not have the young promising people. You might have the young untested. You might have the last people on the last leg. There are a lot of reasons. And, so what we got was some really old pros. Remember, Ernie Wright started at one tackle, and Ernie was probably a 10 or 11-year veteran with a bit of a bad knee when we got him.
Right.
But he was on a relative basis, a very good pass protector. So, we did get some people that could play. Frank Bunkum, who unfortunately died in that first training camp, was a terrific outside linebacker, older guy and a high character guy. And it was tragic. I mean, that was awful. He died in that first training camp, and it was a real blow. And so you ended up with a menagerie of people. And the other thing about that first training camp is, Pete Brown was in charge of player personnel, and we ran people through that training camp. I remember, you could ask Trumpy about this. Trumpy and there were 2 or 3, Chip Myers and 3 or 4 other people. After practice one day, they just said, they called out their names and said, we want to race you 4 guys. And the guys that came in behind Chip and Trumpy got cut the next day. So we always call it the claiming race from then on. But, it was a strange time. And then the interesting thing about Coach Brown is, they were looking for the best players, and they didn't care. I mean, they didn't care whether you were freshly got out of jail, as you may remember. I think this is a fact and not, it's irrefutable. We drafted Jesse Phillips, the fullback, out of the Michigan State Penitentiary.
Right.
And he got him out. I think Coach Brown did it when he got him out on a work release. I think he went and met with the people that ran the penal system and said, hey, if we draft him, we would let him out on a work release program. So, it was a menagerie of a weird bunch of people, old good players, young untested players, and people with great physical ability, but maybe not great players. And so when it all shook out, they tried to put the best people on the field. And we had some people who could play, but with terrible, I hope I don't offend John Shinners, but Shinners had the worst body of anybody that ever played pro football, but he could play. I mean, he was a clever player.
Yeah.
And did you overlap some with him, Lap?
I did, yeah.
Shinners,
those guys, yeah.
You'll attest that John Shinners had the worst body of any pro football, especially linemen. But anyway, but he could play. So Coach Brown took everything you could do, and he only had one goal in life, and that was to have the best team and try to win the most games we could.
Hey, Dave Lapham here to tell you about one of Cincinnati's fastest growing companies, First Star Logistics. They're currently drafting freight brokers to join their sales team. Apply at firststarlogistics.com.
First Star Logistics, opportunity knocking.
So what was it like when Paul Brown got up there to address the team? And here's a guy that's highly decorated, the Cleveland Browns, Otto Graham, all these Hall of Famers, with the Cleveland Browns. When Paul Brown got up as your head coach in that first meeting, and like you said, as training camp wore on, man, was literally hundreds of players rolled through there, I guess. But when Paul got up and addressed the team, it was always very impressive. What was your first impression of Paul Brown?
Well, I grew up in Tennessee, and the Falcons weren't there. So really the teams we got were the Cleveland Browns more than anybody. And so I watched the Browns during a great era when Coach Brown was the coach. Jimmy Brown, Bobby Mitchell, Lou Groza.
Yeah.
They really had a terrific team. And it was a team, you could tell. And then you could tell more as Coach Brown and Jimmy Brown went to odds. And Lap, you know this as well as anybody, but Coach Brown would walk up in front of the team on the very first day. This is a meeting. You're sitting in a meeting room. And he would say, I'm going to give you this same speech every year. Yep. And it's the way we're going to do things. And he started out by saying, I don't care what position you were drafted in. I don't care where you played in college. I don't care if you played in college. My goal in life is to have the 40 best players on the field. And we're going to try to figure out who the 40 best players are, 45, whatever the number was at the time. And that's who's going to make the team. It's going to be the people who in our position are going to help this team win. And like he made it quite clear, he didn't care who you were,
yep,
what you'd done before you got to that training camp. You were judged from there forward. And as you know, you sat there and listened to this too, but I played for 12 years and I listened to the same speech. And I mean, it was almost word for word because he had his notes.
Yeah.
And the nice thing about him is you knew he meant it. I mean, and you knew he wasn't going to be influenced by hardly anybody. I mean, at that point, of course, he had seen it all. He'd been fired by Art Modell in Cleveland. He said, and he didn't mince words, but this team is going to be run the way I think a team should be run. I. And he was a very independent thinking guy. You think about even goofy plays like that triple pass. I think he sat there and thought, that's going to work. So we're going to try it. I don't care how goofy it looks or how goofy anybody thinks it might be. I don't know. In retrospect, I really think I took a lot from him. I mean, I think, as you go forward and you do other things and you get in charge of a business, thinking independently, taking input from people.
Yeah.
But if you're the boss and it comes down to you, you got to sit there and say, this is what I think is best for the team. And I don't care how popular it is. I think it's a great trait. If you can think objectively, to step back and say, here, all by myself, I've come to the conclusion that this is the right thing for me / us to do, and to do it. And I mean, I think I learned a lot as a person from Coach Brown.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he, in retrospect with him, and I agree, the biggest thing I took out of the first time I heard that message, I don't care how you got here. It matters what you do once you're here, once you got here, And I remember after the first time I listened to him, I'm thinking, this guy, if he was in business to be a CEO, he'd own a company. If he's in politics, he'd probably be president. He was just one of those kind of guys, and you mentioned the impact that he had on you in your thought process. Well, you went on from football to be a very successful businessman, entrepreneur. You took Imperial Adhesives and built it and sold it, and extremely successful. So you kicked it extremely well in professional football and the business world. What kind of common traits, what traits did you take from your professional football experience that you applied to your successes in the business world, Bob?
Really, almost everything. I will say one funny thing. When football coaches talk to players, they talk fairly straightforwardly. If you remember Bill Johnson, I remember standing up in front of the whole team and Coach Brown looking at somebody and saying, you've got to play better this next week or you force us to cut you. Well, you don't hear that kind of talk in business, but so I wander from, I think this is hysterical. I wander from pro football and that sort of, straightforward, you got to do better, or we're going to cut you. Um, I I just remember calling this secretary in, uh, and it wasn't Chris Walker, the lady that you and I know so well.
Right, right.
I remember this lady was in charge of our customer service and says, you can't talk to customers that way, blah, 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 blah. And she ran out of the room crying. And Chris Walker walked to the door and looked at me and said, Bob, you're just about as dumb as anybody else. Anyway, so yeah, you're right. That assistant football coach, straightforward conversation didn't work all the time in business. You had to tone it down a little bit.
And people probably, not a whole lot of people may know this, but you had to make a decision, at the conclusion of your playing career. You had an opportunity to coach, right? Or get into the business world. Tell us about that decision that you had to make there, and how big a factor was your lovely wife, Jane?
Well, you may remember Imperial Adhesives was a small division of USU. That was a big company in Cincinnati at the time.
Right.
And so they felt like somebody to run Imperial. So they said, if after your 11th year with the Bengals, you would retire, and we would offer you the presidency of this relatively small company. But I mean, it was a terrific opportunity. And then the Bengals. So I could go home and I go, Jane, and she said at the time, it's either. No, I'm telling this story wrong. So I ended up selecting the Bengals. Then the Bengals the next year came. No, when Bill Johnson stepped up, the Bengals offered me the offensive line job.
Right.
Well, at least they said they wanted to talk to me about it. And I came and said, Jane, this might really be fun. I think football is fascinating. The strategy is fascinating, all this crap. And Jane said, it's either me or football. I am not going to run, because she kept talking about all the long hours, especially assistant coaches, and wives are second-class citizens in the football world. And she said, it's either me or football. So the adhesive company looked good. And, David, as it turned out, the adhesive company was a great path for me. So I can't complain. But I would say that the choice between coaching football and getting involved with the adhesive business was Jane's, not mine.
I hear you.
Well, and honestly, we've been married for 56 years, so I got to look back and say it was the right decision.
No doubt. Right decision for all involved. There's absolutely no question about that. When you watch football today, Bob, I mean, it's so different than when we were playing together in the mid 70s. It is such a totally different game, and it's very, very entertaining though, and it's fast paced. It's offensive oriented. People want yards. People want points. All the things that go along with it. Are you a huge fan of today's football? And what do you think about the Cincinnati Bengals that are being led by Joe Burrow?
Well, to begin with, I think as a player, I'd rather not have offensive linemen have this, I think, difficult to officiate holding. I mean, some of it's ridiculous what you see them get away with, and then sometimes you get a call made that may not have been as egregious a holding as others. I mean, it's kind of hard to. I do think that's a bit of a problem that the officiator got to work on what is holding and what isn't holding, because in some cases, nothing's holding called. So, is it different? Absolutely. Is it better for the average person watching a game? Probably wide open. And I think even way back when, Coach Brown was an advocate of, they called it the Isaac Curtis rule when the bump and run was almost negated because you couldn't put your hands on people. I think people like Coach Brown, and there was a competition committee, maybe there still is, that would say, what can we do to make football more attractive? And as a television sport, I think this business, being able to throw and catch and watch the burros to chase and watch these beautiful athletes operate, where, sometimes the Isaac Curtises, who were a terrific athlete, but he got a little stymied at the line of scrimmage. I think they're probably right. Would I rather watch football in our era? I would, because you and I weren't exactly involved in throwing and catching. We were more involved in
Right.
3 yards in a cloud of dust, which I thought was fascinating, but maybe the general public doesn't quite as much as we did.
Right.
But it sure is different.
It is. It's definitely different. Well, and Bob, I guess I can't thank you enough for carving time to joining us around the draft because of your unique honor of being the very first player the Cincinnati Bengals ever drafted. And boy, did they get it right, because not only a tremendous football player, but just an incredible human being. And you've lived an amazing life, and you are a true treasure of the city of Cincinnati, my man. There's no question about it.
I'll write you that check for saying all those nice things, Lap. But more than that, I just like it when I was getting crushed by somebody, you'd pick him off my nose and save me. So I owe you. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Bob, the best to you and your family, sir. Have the best day you ever had. You
too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dave Lapham here, and every day I am grateful for my experience to have played professional football. As a player, I realize self-motivation, leadership, and appreciating your teammates are key. At First Star Logistics, you can use those same attributes to create the life you want for you and your family. Build your future by working hard like I did. You'll see results both on and off the field. Call First Star Logistics today and be part of our winning team.
Opportunity knocking.